Chapter 1. Introduction. The First Global War. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, is considered by many historians to be the first real world war in history, long before the two great wars of the 20th century affected the world. Because what began here was not only a European conflict between the great powers, but a war that reached all continents: Europe, North America, South America, Africa, India, and the world's oceans were part of this huge struggle for power, influence, and territory. An era of rivalries. The 18th century was an era of profound upheavals. Since the Peace of Westphalia, 1648, the powers of Europe had established themselves in a fragile equilibrium. But this balance was fragile. After losing Silesia to Prussia in the War of the Austrian Succession, 1740 to 1748, Austria tried to restore its position. Prussia, under Frederick II the Great, rose to become a new power and threatened the old order. France and England competed not only in Europe, but especially overseas for colonies, trade routes, and maritime supremacy. Russia increasingly interfered in European affairs, while Spain was still important as a colonial power, but already weakened. The world had moved closer together. Trade interests, colonial policy, and dynastic ambitions were intertwined. A war on 4 continents. The 7 Years' War differed from previous European conflicts in its global dimension. In Europe, the real core conflict was raging: Prussia against Austria, supported by France and Russia. In North America, the British and French fought for supremacy on the continent in the so-called French and Indian War. In India, the British and French East India Companies fought for influence, power, and trade monopolies. On the world's oceans, the British fleet decided in a series of naval battles and blockades over access to colonies, resources, and markets. This made the 7 Years' War the first conflict in which the whole world was really affected. The role of Frederick the Great. A central figure of the war was Frederick II of Prussia, known as the Great. His Prussia was young, ambitious, and dangerous, but also vulnerable. He had hit Austria hard with Silesia, but Maria Theresa wanted to regain this province. Frederick realized that he was surrounded and decided to launch a preemptive strike by occupying Saxony in 1756. This was the beginning of the war that was to lead Prussia to the brink of ruin, and which at the same time established its fame as one of the greatest generals in history. England versus France, a global duel. Parallel to the European conflict, the battle between England and France was raging overseas. In North America, it was about controlling the colonies, rivers, and forts. The British colonists and their Indian allies faced the French troops and their allies. In India, the trade interests of the two nations clashed. This was the beginning of the rise of the British East India Company, which was to lead to the long-term domination of the subcontinent. On the world's oceans, England used her naval power to cut off France from supplies and colonies. This duel ultimately decided the future of the world powers. England rose to become a global superpower. France lost large parts of its colonial empire. A war of extremes. The 7 Years' War was not only a war of diplomacy and battles, but also a war of extremes. Unusual alliances. Austria and France, enemies for centuries, suddenly became partners. The diplomatic revolution. Unusual battles. Prussia, far outnumbered, held out for years against the overpowering coalition of Austria, France, Russia, and Sweden. Unusual twists. The death of the Russian Tsarina, Elizabeth, in 1762, the miracle of the House of Brandenburg, saved Frederick II from defeat. Such dramatic twists and turns made the war a historic epic. Consequences of global proportions. The war ended in 1763 with the Peace of Hubertusburg, Europe, and the Peace of Paris, colonial territories. The consequences were enormous. Prussia finally rose to become a major European power. Austria had to give up Silesia but introduced reforms. England won Canada and India, the foundation stone for the British Empire. France lost large parts of its colonial empire and slipped into a crisis that contributed to the revolution in the long term. Russia finally entered the European stage as a great power. The 7 Years' War thus marked an epochal change in world history. Conclusion of the introduction. The 7 Years' War was more than a mere struggle for territory. It was a struggle for world supremacy in which the course was set for the 19th and 20th centuries. England's rise, France's weakening, Prussia's establishment, Russia's expansion. It was also a lesson in diplomacy, alliances, intrigues, and battles, and is therefore rightly considered the first global war of modern times. Chapter 2. Europe in the 18th Century. Balance of Power and Rivalries. Europe after the Peace of Westphalia. Since the Peace of Westphalia of 1648, the European state system has been characterized by a fragile equilibrium. No empire was allowed to become so powerful that it threatened the others. This principle, which was later called the balance of power, determined the foreign policy of all the great powers. But by the 18th century, this balance had been shaken. Dynastic wars, colonial ambitions, and emerging new powers shook the system. The old order, Austria and France. Austria. The House of Habsburg provided the emperors of the Holy Roman Empire for centuries. Under Maria Theresa, Austria was the central Catholic power. But the Habsburgs had suffered severe defeats in the War of the Austrian Succession, 1740 to 1748, and lost rich Silesia to Prussia. Their goal was clear: to reconquer Silesia and maintain supremacy in the empire. France. France had been the leading power in Europe in the 17th century under Louis XIV. But since the War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, it had lost its luster. France's strength lay less in Europe than in its great colonial empire: Canada, Louisiana, the Caribbean, India. His main opponent was England, which wanted to push France back on the seas and in the colonies. The New Order: England and Prussia. England, Great Britain. England had developed into a parliamentary monarchy after the Glorious Revolution. It relied on trade and the fleet. Britannia rules the waves became the leitmotif. The colonies in North America and the trading posts in India were of growing importance. England saw France as its main rival in the struggle overseas and looked for allies in Europe to protect itself there. Prussia. Prussia was the upstart of the 18th century. Under Frederick William I, the country had become a tightly organized military state. His son Frederick II, the Great, conquered rich Silesia in 1740, a shock for Austria. Prussia had thus risen from a border state to Europe's fifth great power. Russia and Spain, the second great powers. Russia. Under Peter the Great and his successors, Russia had massively expanded its influence. It was now a factor in Central Europe, with interests in Poland, the Ottoman Empire, and the Baltic Sea region. Tsarines like Elizabeth and Catherine II made Russia a power that no one could ignore. Spain. Spain had been losing power since the 17th century, but it still had a huge colonial empire in South America. In foreign policy, Spain has traditionally oriented itself towards France. The Holy Roman Empire. In the 18th century, the empire was a patchwork of hundreds of principalities. Officially, the emperor, Habsburg, was the head, but the imperial estates had great independence. The rivalry between Austria and Prussia shaped imperial policy. Many smaller princely states played a role as allies or battlefields. Thus, the empire was not a closed entity, but rather a theater for the power politics of the great powers. Colonial rivalries. In addition to the European conflicts, the colonies played a decisive role. England versus France in North America. Dispute over control of the Ohio Valley, the Great Lakes, and trade routes. England versus France in India. Struggle for influence on the subcontinent. Caribbean. Sugar islands such as Guadeloupe or Martinique were economically more valuable than many European territories. These colonial conflicts were closely linked to the European wars. Victories or defeats on one continent had an impact on the other. Alliance systems before the war. Before the 7 Years' War, the powers were organized in traditional alliances. England with Austria against France. Prussia isolated but pragmatic. Russia changed sides depending on the situation. But this structure changed dramatically in the mid-1750s. The tension is rising. The rise of Prussia, Austria's desire for revenge, and the colonial rivalries between England and France led to a highly explosive situation. No state wanted to give in. Everyone looked for alliances to strengthen their position. The world was on the verge of a major war that would affect Europe and the colonies alike. Result: Europe in the 18th century was a powder keg. Austria and Prussia fought for supremacy in the Reich. France and England fought over the world's oceans and colonies. Russia got involved as a new great power. Spain played a supporting role, but was linked to France. In this situation, a spark was enough, and war broke out. The next step was the diplomatic revolution of 1756, which completely turned the European alliance system upside down. Chapter 3. The Road to War, 1756. The Diplomatic Revolution. The starting point. The War of the Austrian Succession. To understand the causes of the 7 Years' War, one must look at the War of the Austrian Succession, 1740 to 1748. Maria Theresa ascended the throne of the Habsburgs in 1740, which many powers saw as an opportunity to attack Austria's possessions. Frederick II of Prussia took advantage of the weakness and conquered Silesia, a rich province with flourishing industry. In the Treaty of Aachen, 1748, Austria had to cede Silesia to Prussia. For Maria Theresa, the loss of Silesia was a humiliation. She swore to win it back. For Frederick, the possession of Silesia was a gain in prestige, which he wanted to defend at all costs. This planted the seed for the 7 Years' War. Austria wanted back what Prussia had conquered. Traditional alliances. Until the mid-1750s, the European alliance system looked like this. Austria was traditionally allied with Great Britain, as both feared a strong France. France was Austria's old hereditary enemy, whose supremacy in the empire it always fought. Prussia was an outsider, isolated but ambitious. Russia changed its loyalties depending on the situation. But these old fronts began to dissolve. The role of England. England pursued a clear strategy: weaken France and win colonies. In North America, there were more and more battles between British and French troops. British and French trade interests also clashed in India. England needed a strong partner in Europe to bind France there, and this partner was no longer Austria but Prussia. Austria's new course. Maria Theresa had recognized that Great Britain was primarily pursuing colonial interests and was not prepared to make great sacrifices for the reconquest of Silesia. Her most important advisor, Count Kaunitz, therefore proposed a radical turnaround. Instead of fighting against France, France should be won over as an ally. Together with France and Russia, Prussia could be encircled and smashed. This was a diplomatic earthquake because it meant the departure from centuries of enmity between the Habsburgs and the Bourbons. The Diplomatic Revolution. In 1756, this historic change of alliance actually occurred. Austria and France concluded a defensive alliance. Prussia and Great Britain entered into an alliance, the so-called Westminster Treaty. This turned the European order completely upside down. Prussia, the upstart, was now a partner of the powerful British naval power. Austria, the old Habsburg power, allied itself with the former hereditary enemy France. Russia joined the alliance against Prussia, as did smaller German states and Sweden. Friedrich's location. Frederick II of Prussia was suddenly faced with a catastrophe. Around him, a superior force of Austria, France, Russia, Saxony, and Sweden formed. Prussia had only about 4.5 million inhabitants, while its opponents had more than 90 million. A war against such a coalition seemed hopeless. But Friedrich decided not to wait. He acted according to his motto, "The best defense is the offense." The preemptive strike against Saxony. In August 1756, Frederick marched into the electorate of Saxony with his army. Saxony was a small but strategically important imperial state and allied with Austria. By occupying it, Frederick wanted to eliminate a parade ground of his enemies and secure his own position in the empire. This attack was the official beginning of the 7 Years' War. International reactions. Friedrich's actions caused outrage in Europe. Austria took the opportunity to portray him as an aggressor. France declared war on Prussia. Russia mobilized its troops. England supported Prussia financially, but could provide little direct help in Europe. In doing so, Friedrich had accelerated the war which he actually wanted to avoid through his preemptive strike, but under conditions that he had chosen himself. A global conflict arises. While the first shots were fired in Europe, the conflict quickly spread. In North America, the French and Indian War had been going on since 1754. In India, the trading companies of England and France fought for influence. A bitter naval war began on the seas, in which England played out its fleet strength. In this way, the European power struggle was combined with colonial rivalries. The 7 Years' War became the first global war of modern times. Result: the diplomatic revolution of 1756 was a turning point in European history. Centuries-old enmities were abandoned, new alliances forged. Austria and France united against the upstart Prussia. Great Britain and Prussia combined their interests to form a new axis. Friedrich's attack on Saxony marked the beginning of the 7 Years' War, a war that was to change Europe and the world. Chapter 4. The Outbreak of War. Frederick's Attack on Saxony, 1756. The situation in the summer of 1756. The diplomatic revolution had radically changed the European power structure. Frederick II of Prussia faced an overpowering coalition. Austria, France, Russia, Saxony, Sweden, an alliance that wanted to destroy Prussia at its core. Frederick knew that if he waited, he would be overrun from all sides. He acted according to the principle that a preemptive attack was his only chance of survival. The March to Saxony. On 29 August 1756, the Prussian army crossed the border into Saxony. Around 60,000 men invaded the small electorate. Saxony was militarily weak but strategically important. It was located between Prussia and Austria and could serve as a deployment base. Frederick hoped to quickly neutralize the Saxon army and use the country as a resource for his own war plans. The electorate of Saxony, who was also king of Poland, fled to Poland. The Saxon army entrenched itself near Pirna in the Elbe Sandstone Mountains. The Pirna Camp. The Saxon army, about 18,000 strong, retreated to a fortified camp near Pirna. Frederick tried to encircle the camp and force the Saxons to capitulate. He hoped to create facts through quick action before Austria and France could react. But the siege dragged on. The Saxons held their ground while Austrian auxiliary troops approached. The Battle of Lobositz, 1 October 1756. To stop the Austrian relief army, Frederick marched to Bohemia. On October 1, 1756, the first major battle of the war took place near Lobositz. The Prussians met about 34,000 Austrians under Field Marshal Browne. Fog and confusing terrain made Friedrich's tactics difficult. After heavy losses, the Prussians finally succeeded in pushing back the Austrians. Tactically, the battle was undecided, but strategically it was a success for Frederick. The Austrians could not save the Saxons. The capitulation of Pirna. After the Battle of Lobositz, the situation of the Saxons was hopeless. On 14 October 1756, the entire Saxon army capitulated.
Around 18,000 Saxon soldiers were taken prisoner by the Prussians. Frederick forced many of them to join the Prussian army, a step that caused outrage in Europe. Saxony was occupied. Its resources were at the disposal of Prussia. Although Frederick had achieved a quick success, he had also incurred the hatred of many imperial estates. Reactions in Europe. Frederick's attack on Saxony was regarded by many powers as an act of aggression. Austria used the attack for propaganda purposes to portray Prussia as a troublemaker. France declared war on Prussia and began to gather troops in West Germany. Russia mobilized its army against Frederick. Sweden joined the anti-Prussian coalition. Instead of dividing his opponents, Frederick had united them. England as a Prussian ally. While Frederick was isolated in Europe, England secured him financial support. In the Westminster Treaty, Great Britain had committed itself to supporting Prussia against attacks in Germany. England provided annual subsidies of £670,000, an enormous sum. In addition, England tied up French forces through the colonial war in North America and India. Frederick was militarily alone, but economically and strategically not completely isolated. Friedrich's calculation. With the occupation of Saxony, Frederick had achieved several goals. He secured his southern flank against Austria. He gained a deployment base for operations in Bohemia. He strengthened his resources in the short term through the Saxon reserves. But it had also created enormous risks. He now openly stood there as an aggressor. He had almost all the major European powers against him. His army was disciplined and modern, but far outnumbered. The starting point for the war. At the end of 1756, the situation was clear. Prussia had occupied Saxony and won its first victories, but it was surrounded by enemies. Austria was planning a major attack with Russia and France. England was preparing the global struggle against France from America to India. This was the beginning of the actual 7 Years' War, a struggle that was to last 7 years and change the world. Result: Frederick's attack on Saxony in 1756 was a bold but risky step. It brought short-term advantages to Prussia, but isolated it diplomatically. The capitulation of Pirna was a triumph that cemented Frederick's reputation as a determined general. But he had now unleashed a war that he had to fight against a huge superiority. The 7 Years' War began with a blow that shook Europe and plunged Frederick's Prussia into the greatest battle in its history.
Chapter 5. The Great Battles in Europe, 1757 to 1760. 1757, a year of extremes. After the capture of Saxony, Frederick II knew that Austria and its allies would retaliate. The year 1757 became a decisive touchstone for Prussia, marked by dramatic defeats but also by brilliant victories that established Frederick's reputation as the Great. The Battle of Kollin, 18 June 1757. Frederick wanted to eliminate Austria with a quick campaign in Bohemia. After the victory at Lobositz in 1756, he marched towards Prague and besieged the city. On 18 June 1757, he was opposed by an Austrian army of around 54,000 men under Field Marshal Daun at Kollin. Frederick's army numbered about 32,000 men. He was greatly outnumbered. He relied on a flank attack, but the Austrians held their ground. The battle ended in a catastrophic defeat for Prussia. Around 14,000 men were lost, and the siege of Prague had to be lifted. For Maria Theresa, Kollin was a triumph. She had shown that Frederick could be defeated. The Battle of Hastenbeck, 26 July 1757. Meanwhile, the French tried to advance in West Germany. At Hastenbeck, 60,000 French met 40,000 troops of the Duke of Cumberland, who fought on behalf of England. The French won. Hanover was occupied. Thus, the situation seemed hopeless for Frederick in the summer of 1757. He had suffered a defeat in the east, while France had an advantage in the west. The Battle of Rossbach, 5 November 1757. But Frederick did not give up. In the autumn of 1757, he turned west to confront the French and imperial troops at Rossbach in Saxony.
Around 41,000 French and Imperial troops met only 22,000 Prussians. Frederick relied on his superior cavalry under Seydlitz. In a masterful maneuver, he surprised the opponents, overran their flank, and destroyed their army in a few hours. The losses: French and Imperial troops, approximately 10,000 men. Prussia, only about 550 men. Rossbach became a symbol of Prussian military art. Europe was shocked how a small army could defeat a vastly superior force so devastatingly. The Battle of Leuthen, 5 December 1757. Only 1 month later, on 5 December 1757, Frederick achieved another triumph, Leuthen in Silesia. About 66,000 Austrians faced 36,000 Prussians. Frederick used the oblique order of battle. He concentrated his forces on one wing and broke through the Austrian line. The Austrians lost 22,000 men, the Prussians about 6,000. Leuthen is still considered a lesson in military tactics today. Frederick himself called it his greatest victory. At the end of 1757, the situation was completely changed. After Rossbach and Leuthen, Frederick was once again considered invincible. 1758, Zorndorf and Hochkirch. The Battle of Zorndorf, 25 August 1758. In 1758, a Russian army marched into Brandenburg. Frederick confronted them at Zorndorf. 43,000 Prussians against 42,000 Russians. The battle was one of the most brutal of the war, hand-to-hand combat with enormous losses. Result: draw, but strategically important as the Russians retreated. Losses: Russians, approximately 21,000. Prussia, ca. 13,000. Zorndorf showed that Frederick could also hold his own against Russia, albeit at high cost. The Battle of Hochkirch, 14 October 1758. In the same year, Frederick suffered a heavy defeat at Hochkirch in Saxony. The Austrians under Daun surprised the Prussian camp at Daun. Frederick lost 9,000 men and almost all of his artillery. Only through discipline could he prevent a complete catastrophe. Hochkirch was a setback that showed that the coalition was learning and that Frederick was not invulnerable. 1759, the catastrophe of Kunersdorf. The year 1759 brought Frederick to the brink of ruin. The Battle of Kunersdorf, 12 August 1759. Frederick attacked a Russian-Austrian army near Kunersdorf, east of Frankfurt on der Oder. At first he seemed successful, but in the afternoon his exhausted army collapsed. Losses: Prussia, about 20,000 men, half of its armed forces. Frederick was desperate. He wrote after the battle, "I lost everything except my life." Kunersdorf was the low point of the war for Prussia. 1760, Torgau. Despite the catastrophe, Frederick continued to fight. The Battle of Torgau, 3 November 1760. Frederick once again faced the Austrians under Daun. In a battle with heavy losses, both sides suffered heavy losses. Strategically, Frederick had the upper hand, as he was able to hold Saxony. Torgau was not a brilliant victory like Leuthen, but proof of Frederick's perseverance. Balance sheet of the years 1757 to 1760. Frederick achieved legendary victories, Rossbach, Leuthen, which entered him in the history books. At the same time, he suffered devastating defeats, Kunersdorf, which almost destroyed Prussia. His army was disciplined and tactically superior, but the superiority of his enemies was overwhelming. Without England, which supported him financially and tied France overseas, Frederick would probably have failed. Result: the years 1757 to 1756 were a roller coaster of triumphs and catastrophes. Rossbach and Leuthen made Frederick a military genius. Kunersdorf showed how close he was to the abyss. Torgau proved his tenacity. The war was far from over, but one thing was clear: Prussia was fighting for survival, and Europe was amazed at the small state that stood its ground against an entire coalition.
Chapter 6: The War in North America, French and Indian War. The colonial background. The European conflict between England and France was reflected in North America with particular sharpness. The two colonial powers had been hostile to each other since the 1740s. France controlled large parts of Canada, New France, the Mississippi Valley, and Louisiana. England settled the 13 colonies on the East Coast. Between the two areas lay the Ohio Valley, a fertile region that was crucial for trade and expansion. The control there was the immediate trigger for the war in North America. First battles, 1754 to 1755. Even before the official start of the 7 Years' War, fighting took place in North America that became known as the French and Indian War. In 1754, a young officer named George Washington marched into the Ohio Valley with a Virginia militia. At Fort Necessity, however, he suffered a defeat against the French. In 1755, General Braddock led a British expedition against Fort Duquesne, but it ended in disaster. Braddock fell, and the British troops were repulsed. These early defeats showed the strength of the French position and its Indian allies. The role of indigenous peoples. The North American natives played a central role in the war. Many tribes, such as the Hurons and Algonquins, fought on the side of France. Others, most notably the Iroquois Confederacy, supported the British. For the indigenous peoples, the war was an opportunity to assert their interests against the colonial powers, but in the end they became the big losers. The British Revolution, 1757 to 1758. At first, France seemed superior, but in 1757 there was a turning point. In London, William Pitt the Elder took over the affairs of government. He relied on a clear strategy. England was to use its naval power to weaken France globally, while the colonies were fighting the war in North America. Pitt provided enormous financial resources and generously supported the colonists. This led to a huge upswing in the British war effort. The decisive battles. Louisbourg, 1758. The fortress of Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island was the key to the St. Lawrence River. After a siege, the French garrison capitulated. The way to Canada was clear. Fort Duquesne, 1758. The British captured the fort at the confluence of the Allegheny and Monongahela. They renamed it Fort Pitt, later Pittsburgh. Quebec, 1759, the Battle of the Abraham Heights. On September 13, 1759, the decisive battle for Quebec took place. General James Wolfe led the British against the troops of the Marquis de Montcalm. Both commanders fell in battle, but the British won. Quebec capitulated, a turning point in the war. Montreal, 1760. A year later, Montreal also fell. This meant that New France was lost, and Canada finally fell to England. The French defeat. France could not hold North America. His supply lines across the Atlantic were blocked by the British fleet. Reinforcements came too late or were intercepted. The French colonies were too weak to survive alone against British superiority. France lost almost its entire colonial empire in North America. Effects on the colonies. England's victory had enormous consequences for the 13 colonies. England now controlled all of Canada and the country up to the Mississippi River. The colonists felt strengthened and more self-confident. At the same time, tensions with the motherland grew, as London wanted to tax the colonies more heavily after the war to cover the enormous costs of the war. Many historians see the roots of the American Revolution of 1776 here. Balance of the war in North America. England, clear winner. Control of Canada and the Ohio Valley. France, decisive loser. Loss of almost all possessions in North America. Indigenous peoples. Short-term allies, long-term losers, as their territories were now threatened by British settlers. Colonists. More self-confident, but also more dissatisfied with British politics. A breeding ground for independence efforts. Result. The war in North America was not just a sideshow, but a crucial part of the 7 Years' War. It decided colonial domination in the New World. It strengthened England and weakened France permanently. It indirectly laid the foundation for the independence of the USA. While Frederick the Great fought for the survival of Prussia in Europe, in North America, the British Army laid the foundation for a world empire and for the birth of a new nation.
Chapter 7. The War in India. India as a key colonial area. In the 18th century, India was a mosaic of princely states, regional empires, and trading centers. Although the Mughal Empire still formally ruled, its power had largely disintegrated. The European powers penetrated into this power vacuum. France relied on its trading bases in Pondicherry and Chandernagore. England controlled Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay through the British East India Company. Both powers wanted to expand their influence on the subcontinent, and the 7 Years' War gave them the opportunity to do so. Harbingers, the Second Carnatic War, 1749 to 1754. Even before the 7 Years' War, the British and French had fought their rivalry in India. In southern India, Carnatic, they fought for supremacy. Both sides used Indian princes as allies. The war ended without a clear decision, but the British were able to consolidate their position. This made it clear that the next major conflict would also affect India. 1756, the fall of Calcutta. In the summer of 1756, the war in India began with a shock. The Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, attacked the British Fort William in Calcutta. The garrison surrendered, and many prisoners died in the so-called Black Hole of Calcutta episode, an event that sparked outrage in England. The British called in reinforcements under the leadership of Robert Clive. Robert Clive and the Rise of England. Robert Clive, officer and adventurer, was one of the most dazzling figures of the war. He led the British to reconquer Calcutta in January 1757. He then allied himself with Indian princes who were dissatisfied with the Nawab. The decisive moment came in June 1757. The Battle of Plassey, 23 June 1757. At Plassey, Clive's 3,000 British soldiers and Indian allies met 50,000 Nawab men. Due to betrayal in the Nawab's camp, his general, Mir Jafar, changed sides. Clive won despite being outnumbered. Siraj-ud-Dowlah was overthrown. Mir Jafar installed as puppet ruler. The British East India Company took control of Bengal, the richest province in India. Plassey is considered a turning point. It marked the beginning of British domination in India. The war against the French. While the British were expanding their influence in Bengal, they were fighting the French in southern India. In 1758, the French general Comte de Lally landed in India and tried to conquer Madras. Clive and his allies held their ground. The decisive battle took place in 1760 at Wandiwash. The British clearly defeated the French. After Wandiwash, French power in India was broken. The Peace of Paris, 1763, and India. In the Treaty of Paris, 1763, which ended the 7 Years' War, the Indian questions were also settled. France was allowed to keep some trading bases, example Pondicherry, but had to renounce military ambitions. The British East India Company was given a free hand to expand its rule in Bengal and other regions. This eliminated France as a serious rival in India. Consequences for India. The war had profound consequences. Bengal became the treasury of the British East India Company. Its resources financed the further rise of England. The Indian princes became increasingly dependent on British support. France's influence shrank to a few enclaves. For the Indian population, this meant a new era, the gradual subjugation of the subcontinent under British control. Robert Clive, symbol and scandal. Clive was hailed as a hero in England, but his methods were controversial. He used corruption, intrigue, and betrayal. His wealth was based on exploitation. Nevertheless, he is considered the founder of British India. Result: the war in India was a decisive theater of the 7 Years' War. It sealed England's rise to become Asia's leading colonial power. It ended France's ambitions in India. It laid the foundation for the British Empire of the 19th century. While the battles of Leuthen, Kunersdorf, or Torgau raged in Europe, in India the Battle of Plassey decided the colonial future of the subcontinent, and thus world history.
Chapter 8. The Naval War, England against France on the Oceans. The importance of naval power. The 7 Years' War was not only a struggle for territory in Europe, but above all a war for supremacy on the world's oceans. For England, the fleet was the most important instrument for cutting France off from its colonies and overseas territories. France had a respectable navy, but was economically and financially weaker. The war was ultimately decided at sea, and England emerged as the clear winner. England's strategy. Under Prime Minister William Pitt the Elder, England relied on a clear maritime strategy. Blockades of French ports to prevent overseas supplies. Protection of its own trade, especially with the colonies in North America, India, and the Caribbean. Concentration on naval battles to destroy the French fleet. This strategy was successful because England had a larger merchant fleet, better finances, and experienced sailors. First successes, 1757 to 1758. Already at the beginning of the war, the British achieved important successes. 1757, Battle of Lagos. Admiral Boscawen defeated a French fleet that wanted to sail to India. 1758, Battle of Cartagena. The British prevented French reinforcements for North America. 1758, capture of Louisbourg. The naval blockade made the fortress vulnerable. The fall opened the way to Quebec. France gradually lost control of the Atlantic. The Annus Mirabilis, 1759. The year 1759 is considered England's miracle year, Annus Mirabilis, especially because of the successes at sea. Battle of Quiberon Bay, 20 November 1759. The French fleet was trying to prepare for an invasion of England. Admiral Hawke attacked her in heavy seas and almost completely destroyed her. France was then no longer in a position to threaten England directly. With Quiberon, French naval power was broken. Colonial successes through naval supremacy. Thanks to its superiority at sea, England was able to secure its colonies and conquer new territories. In North America, the fleet supported the conquest of Quebec and Montreal. In the Caribbean, French islands such as Guadeloupe, 1759, and Martinique, 1762, fell into British hands. In India, the British cut France off from reinforcements and won battles such as Wandiwash. The control of the sea routes allowed England to connect theaters of war, something that France did not succeed in. France's weakness. France had several problems that weakened its navy. Lack of finances. The state was heavily indebted. Internal rivalries between the army and the navy. The army was preferred. Inadequate ports and logistical problems. While England was constantly strengthening its fleet, France was hardly able to replace losses. Spain enters the war. In 1762, Spain entered the war on the side of France. Spain wanted to defend its colonies in America and Asia. But the British used their naval supremacy to conquer Cuba, Havana, and the Philippines, Manila. Spain had to return these territories in the Peace of 1763, but received Louisiana from France as compensation. Balance of the naval war. England, absolute supremacy on the world's oceans. Control of important colonies in North America, India, and the Caribbean. Basis for the later British Empire. France, loss of his naval supremacy. Defeat in North America and India. Loss of many colonies. Spain, entered the war late but also weakened. The naval war decided the global character of the conflict. England became the leading world power. Result. Naval warfare was at the heart of global struggle in the 7 Years' War. England consistently used its maritime strength to blockade France, conquer colonies, and wield global power. France was unable to achieve any decisive victories at sea and thus lost its colonial empires. With the defeat at Quiberon in 1759, the French navy was permanently weakened. Without England's naval supremacy, the war in North America, India, and the Caribbean could not have been won. The 7 Years' War finally made England the leading maritime power,
a position it retained until the 20th century.
Chapter 9. Diplomacy and Alliance Systems. Diplomacy in the 18th century. The 7 Years' War was not only a military war, but also a diplomatic war. Behind the battles were constant negotiations, alliance changes, and secret agreements. The European powers were at war, but they were just as intensely engaged in diplomacy in the background. The Diplomatic Revolution, 1756. Even before the war began, Europe's alliance system had been completely turned upside down by the Diplomatic Revolution. Austria and France, rivals for centuries, suddenly became allies. Prussia allied itself with Great Britain, its former adversary. Russia joined Austria and France. Sweden also joined the coalition against Prussia. This constellation almost completely isolated Prussia. Frederick the Great was surrounded by enemies. Austria's goals. Maria Theresa wanted to regain Silesia at any price. To this end, she was willing to work with France. Field Marshal Daun and Austrian diplomacy worked tirelessly to keep the coalition together against Prussia. France's goals. France's main opponent was Great Britain. It wanted to weaken British naval power and conquer colonies. In Europe, France was less interested in Prussia itself, but fought to secure its own interests. The alliance with Austria was more of a means to an end for France. Russia's role. Russia was a decisive factor in the alliance system. Tsarina Elizabeth saw Frederick II as a dangerous opponent and supported Austria. Russian troops marched deep into Prussia and at times even stood in Berlin. But with Elizabeth's death in 1762, everything changed. The new Tsar, Peter III, admired Frederick and, surprisingly, withdrew Russia from the war. This went down in history as the miracle of the House of Brandenburg. Great Britain and Prussia. The alliance between Prussia and Great Britain was pragmatic. Great Britain supported Prussia financially. Prussia tied up French and Austrian troops in Europe. This allowed England to concentrate its energy on North America, India, and the oceans. Without British financial aid, Frederick II would not have survived the war for long. Sweden and minor powers. Sweden also took part in the war against Prussia, albeit without great success. It wanted to expand its position in the Baltic Sea region. But militarily, Sweden remained weak and played only a supporting role. The Holy Roman Empire was also divided. Some imperial princes supported Austria, others Prussia. The empire was thus another battlefield of the great powers. Spain enters, 1762. It was only in the last years of the war that Spain entered the war on the side of France. The goal, to protect its colonies in America and Asia. But Spain had little success. The British conquered Havana, Cuba, and Manila, Philippines. Spain had to return these territories in peace and received only Louisiana from France as compensation. The art of balance. The diplomacy of the 7 Years' War was a constant struggle for balance. Austria and France had to coordinate their interests. Russia was unpredictable and changed the entire situation by changing the throne. England put everything on the Prussian card, but only as long as it was strategically useful. The war showed how fragile alliances were. They could change within a few years. Result of diplomacy. In the end, the alliances had only partially achieved their goals. Austria, target, recovery of Silesia, missed. France, goal, weakening England, clearly missed. France lost its colonies. Russia, success, unused as the new Tsar ended the war. Prussia, surprising winner, Silesia could claim. England, biggest winner, became a world power through victories in colonies and at sea. Result. The diplomacy of the 7 Years' War was as decisive as the battles. Alliances decided the course of the war. Russia's sudden change of course saved Prussia. England used its alliance with Prussia to assert itself globally. The war taught Europe that alliances could be flexible, even interchangeable. Power politics, not tradition, determined the diplomacy of the 18th century. Chapter 10. The Course of the War, 1759–1762, turning points. 1759, the Annus Mirabilis. For England, the year 1759 was a miracle year, Annus Mirabilis, while Frederick II was pushed to the brink of ruin in Prussia. Siege England's. Battle of Quiberon, 20 November 1759. The British fleet destroyed the French Atlantic Fleet. France could no longer dare to invade. North America. Victories at Quebec, Battle of the Abraham Heights, and in the Caribbean, capture of Guadeloupe. India. British success at Wandiwash, which weakened France's position. England was at the height of its power in 1759. Friedrich's catastrophe. Battle of Kunersdorf, 12 August 1759. Frederick suffered his worst defeat at the hands of the Russians and Austrians. With losses of 20,000 men, he lost almost his entire army. After the battle, he is said to have said, "Everything is lost except life." Only the hesitation of the Allies saved Prussia from complete destruction. 1760. Between hope and despair. Despite the defeat at Kunersdorf, Friedrich continued to fight. October 1760. Russian troops marched into Berlin, a symbolic low point for Prussia. Battle of Torgau, 3 November 1760. Frederick won a bloody victory against the Austrians, albeit with heavy losses, approx 16,000 men. Torgau was not a triumph like Leuthen or Rossbach, but it showed that Prussia was not yet defeated. 1761. The war wears out. The year 1761 brought hardly any decisive battles, but it revealed the exhaustion of all warring parties. Prussia's army was bled dry, supplies and finances exhausted. Austria was also at the limit. The costs of the war were gigantic. Russia remained active, but motivation dropped. England continued to wage successful colonial wars, but costs rose here as well. 1761 was a year of war of attrition. Everyone was waiting for a decision, but no one could strike the decisive blow. 1762, the miracle of the House of Brandenburg. The year 1762 brought the decisive turning point, not so much through battles as through political events. The death of Tsarina Elizabeth. On January 5, 1762, the Russian Tsarina Elizabeth died. Her successor, Peter III, was an ardent admirer of Frederick the Great. He immediately made peace with Prussia, Peace of St. Petersburg, May 1762, and even sent auxiliary troops. This surprising turn of events, described by Frederick as the miracle of the House of Brandenburg, saved Prussia. Austria isolated. Without Russia, Austria was weakened. France could not help in Europe, as it was overwhelmed by England on the oceans and in the colonies. Prussia was able to stabilize and held Silesia. Spain's entry into the war. In 1762, Spain entered the war on the side of France. But the British promptly conquered Havana, Cuba, and Manila, Philippines. This further weakened Spain. The last fights. In 1762, there were still some battles in Europe, but neither side was able to decide the war. Friedrich successfully defended Silesia. Austria was exhausted and financially at the end. England continued to dominate colonies and sea routes. The war was heading for peace negotiations. Balance of the turning points, 1759 to 1762. England, absolute victors at sea and in the colonies, the basis for a world empire. France, colonial power broken, economically bled dry. Prussia, militarily almost perished, but saved by the miracle and English help. Austria, objective reconquest of Silesia, missed, militarily exhausted. Russia, political change of course changed everything, from the most dangerous opponent to the unexpected savior of Prussia. Spain, entered late, suffered defeats immediately.
Result: the years 1759 to 1762 were the decisive turning points of the 7 Years' War. England secured the colonial victory. Frederick survived only through luck, tenacity, and political coincidences. Austria lost sight of its goal. France and Spain emerged weakened. The war could no longer be continued. All powers were exhausted. The way was clear for the peace treaties of Hubertusburg and Paris, 1763.
Chapter 11. The Peace of Hubertusburg and Paris, 1763. The Path to Peace. After 7 years of war, all European powers were exhausted. Prussia had suffered enormous losses, but was still in possession of Silesia. Austria had bled dry financially and militarily. Russia had been eliminated by the change of course under Peter III. France had largely lost its colonies. England was the clear winner, but wanted peace to secure its winnings. Thus, in 1763, 2 major peace treaties were signed, the Peace of Hubertusburg for Europe and the Peace of Paris for the colonies. The Peace of Hubertusburg, 15 February 1763. Location: Hubertusburg Castle in Saxony. Participants: Prussia, Austria, Saxony. Conditions: status quo ante. All territories were confirmed in their pre-war borders. Silesia remained with Prussia, the most important result. Saxony was evacuated by Prussia, but remained weakened. Hubertusburg was a triumph for Prussia. Despite all the defeats, Frederick II had maintained Silesia. Prussia was thus finally established as a major European power. The Peace of Paris, February 10, 1763. Location: Paris, between the colonial powers England, France, and Spain. England as winners. Canada fell completely to England. Florida fell from Spain to England. France ceded its territories east of the Mississippi. France's losses. France lost almost its entire colonial empire in North America. In India, it was only allowed to keep small trading bases, no more fortified colonies. In the Caribbean, France had to give up important islands such as Grenada, but was allowed to regain Martinique and Guadeloupe. Spain. Spain lost Florida to England. As compensation, it received from France the huge but sparsely populated Louisiana west of the Mississippi. Winners and losers. Winner: England, the biggest profiteer, became the leading world and colonial power. Canada, India, and the Caribbean strengthened the empire. Prussia claimed Silesia, finally rose to the rank of the European great powers. Loser: France lost most of its colonies, prestige, and international importance. Austria failed to regain Silesia. Spain entered late, lost Florida, and was weakened. Significance for Europe. The Peace of Hubertusburg changed the European power order. Prussia was now a recognized great power, on a par with Austria, France, England, and Russia. Austria began comprehensive reforms to compensate for its weakness. Saxony remained weakened and stood in the shadow of Prussia. Meaning for the world. The Peace of Paris had global dimensions. England secured the basis for the British Empire. France lost its position as a global colonial power, a deep humiliation. Spain remained a colonial empire, but its decline began. The war decided the question of which power was to dominate the world in the 18th century. France, but England. Contemporary reactions. In England, peace was celebrated, but some considered it too mild towards France. In France, the defeat was a shock. The humiliation intensified domestic political crises. Frederick II spoke of an honorable peace, but he knew how narrowly he had escaped the catastrophe. Result: the peace treaties of 1763 marked the end of the 7 Years' War. Europe: Prussia remained victorious, Austria lost, the balance of power shifted. Wealth: England became the leading colonial and maritime power, France receded into the background. Long-term, the seeds for new conflicts had been planted. The American independence movement, the French Revolution, and the upheavals of the 19th century had their roots here. 1763 was a turning point in world history. The 7 Years' War had reshuffled the cards and ushered in a new era. Chapter 12. Consequences for Prussia and Europe. Prussia, from outsider to great power. Before the 7 Years' War, Prussia was an emerging power, but not yet an integral part of the European concert. Many saw the empire of Frederick II as militarily dangerous, but politically isolated. After 1763, the situation was completely different. Silesia remained in Prussian possession. Frederick II had shown that a small state could hold its own against a European coalition. Prussia was finally admitted to the circle of the 5 European great powers: England, France, Austria, Russia, and Prussia. The war was the birth of Prussia as a European great power and the beginning of its special role in German history. Austria, defeat and reform. For Austria, the war was a bitter defeat. Maria Theresa had to renounce Silesia for good. Austria had suffered enormous losses in soldiers and finances. The dream of weakening or even destroying Prussia had failed. But the defeat also led to reforms: modernization of the army and administration, strengthening the central structures in the multi-ethnic state, a more cautious foreign policy that relied on diplomacy instead of direct confrontation with Prussia in the coming decades. Austria remained a great power, but its supremacy in the empire was shaken. France, loss of prestige in Europe. France had allied itself with Austria to bring Prussia to its knees, and failed. The war had weakened France without making any significant gains in Europe. The loss of prestige was considerable. France was no longer considered the undisputed leading European power. Many nobles and military officers blamed naval policy and colonial adventures. France's defeat ushered in a domestic political crisis that would lead to revolution decades later. Russia, an unexpected retreat. Russia played a decisive role in the war. Russian troops penetrated deep into Prussia, even standing in Berlin. In 1762, Russia could have finally smashed Prussia. But the death of Tsarina Elizabeth and the ascension to the throne of Peter III led to an abrupt change of course. Russia made peace with Prussia. This step saved Frederick and changed the European situation. Russia thus showed how strongly domestic political factors could influence European power constellations. England, Europe's banker and power in the background. In Europe itself, England fought only indirectly, but its role was decisive. It financed Prussia with high subsidies. It bound France in North America, India, and at sea. England showed that economic strength and maritime dominance could decide military campaigns. England appeared as the banker of Europe, a model it was to maintain in later wars. Saxony and the minor powers. For Saxony, the war was a catastrophe. It was occupied, plundered, and dominated by Prussia. Its army was forcibly incorporated into the Prussian army. Politically, it remained weakened and could not recover. Other smaller imperial estates also suffered enormously from the war. They became a battlefield between Prussia and Austria. Effects on the empire. The Holy Roman Empire once again showed its weakness in the 7 Years' War. It was not a political entity capable of acting, but a patchwork of rival princes. Prussia and Austria flouted imperial institutions. The war intensified the division between northern Germany, Prussian, and southern Germany, Austrian. In doing so, he laid a foundation for the later conflicts over the German question in the 19th century. The military lessons. For the European powers, the war also brought military lessons. The discipline and tactics of the Prussian army were admired throughout Europe. The importance of finances and supplies became clearer than ever before. It was recognized that wars were no longer decided by battles alone, but by economic sustainability. Result: the 7 Years' War changed the balance of power permanently.
Prussia, final rise to great power. Austria, defeat but impetus for reform. France, weakened and demoralized. Russia, important role but politically unpredictable. England, Europe's financer and indirect winner. Small states, losers, plaything of the powers. Europe was no longer the same after 1763. The balance had shifted. Prussia had risen, and the conflict between the Habsburgs and Hohenzollerns was to continue for a long time to come.
Chapter 13. Consequences for the World. The Global Character of War. The 7 Years' War was the first conflict to be fought not only in Europe, but on several continents at the same time. Its consequences reached far beyond the battlefields of Silesia, Saxony, or Bohemia. North America, India, the Caribbean, Africa, and the world's oceans were reorganized. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 marked the beginning of a new era in world history. England rise to world power. England was the great winner of the war. In North America, it received Canada and the country as far as the Mississippi River. In India, it mated France and laid the foundation for British colonial rule. In the Caribbean, it won rich sugar islands and even conquered Havana and Manila for a short time. On the world's oceans, the Royal Navy was unchallenged. The result, England rose to become the leading global superpower. The British Empire took shape, which was to reach its peak in the 19th century. France, the big loser. France lost its role as a global power. The loss of Canada and Louisiana marked the end of his North American ambitions. In India, his influence shrank to a few trading bases. It also lost important positions in the Caribbean and Africa. The humiliation also had domestic political consequences. The defeat weakened confidence in the monarchy. The loss of colonies led to economic crises. Many historians see the 7 Years' War as a prehistory of the French Revolution, 1789. Spain, delayed and weakened. Spain did not enter the war until 1762, too late to intervene decisively. It lost Florida to England. Although it received Louisiana from France as compensation, the area was sparsely populated and economically weak. The loss of Havana and Manila, even if only temporarily, showed the vulnerability of the Spanish colonial empire. The war initiated the gradual decline of Spain as a world power. The American colonies. For the 13 British colonies in North America, the victory over France was a turning point. The French danger in the West was averted. The colonists felt stronger and more self-confident. But Great Britain wanted to cover the high costs of the war with new taxes, e.g. Stamp Act, Sugar Act. This led to growing discontent and finally to the American Revolution of 1776. Without the 7 Years' War, the USA might not have existed in its later form. India, beginning of British dominance. The consequences for India were epochal. After the victories at Plassey, 1757, and Wandiwash, 1760, the British East India Company was the dominant power. France had to give up its ambitions and was allowed to keep only a few trading bases. Bengal became the economic base of British expansion in Asia. The 7 Years' War marked the beginning of British colonial rule in India, which was to last almost 200 years. Africa and the Caribbean. The war also had consequences in Africa and the Caribbean. The Caribbean islands, e.g. Guadeloupe, Martinique, Grenada, were particularly contested because of their abundance of sugar. England gained some of these islands and thus strengthened its trading power. In Africa, it was mainly about trading bases on the coast, which were important for the slave trade. The war strengthened the role of transatlantic trade and the economic interdependence of the world. Russia and Eastern Europe. Russia's role in the 7 Years' War showed that it was a new great power. It was able to penetrate militarily deep into Central Europe. Politically, however, it was unstable. The abrupt change of course under Peter III made his role unpredictable.
The war marked the beginning of Russia as a decisive factor in the European power structure. Global networking and World War. The 7 Years' War was more than a European conflict. It was a global war. Decisions in North America influenced peace in Europe. The naval battles in the Atlantic decided the outcome in India. Colonial gains and losses had a direct impact on domestic politics in Europe. For the first time, it became clear that the world was interconnected. A war in one part of the world could have consequences for all others. Result: the global consequences of the 7 Years' War were profound. England, rise to world power. France, loss of its global leadership role. Spain, beginning of decline. America, precursor to U.S. independence. India, beginning of British colonial rule. Russia, establishing itself as a European great power. The 7 Years' War was a turning point in world history. It decided who would dominate the world in the 18th and 19th century.
Chapter 14. Conclusion. The 7 Years' War as the First World War. A global war. The 7 Years' War, 1756–1763, was more than a dynastic conflict between European powers. It was the first war that really swept the whole world. In Europe, Prussia, Austria, France, Russia, and other powers fought for territory and influence. In North America, the French and Indian War was raging, which decided the future of the continent. In India, the foundation for the British Empire was laid. On the world's oceans, England fought for maritime supremacy. Even the Caribbean, Africa, and the Philippines were part of this global struggle. The war showed for the first time that conflicts were no longer limited to regions, but had global dimensions. Winners and losers. Winner, England, emerged as the clear winner and rose to become the dominant world power. His fleet and colonies laid the foundation for the British Empire. Prussia asserted itself despite the superiority of its opponents and finally became a great European power. Loser, France, lost Canada, India, and its global political prestige. Austria failed to regain Silesia. Spain lost colonies and began its slow decline. Turning point in history. The 7 Years' War changed the world in several ways. Balance of power in Europe. Prussia's rise called the Habsburg Empire into question, and the rivalry between the two powers shaped the German question until the 19th century. Colonial reorganization. England took over the leading role in North America, India, and on the world's oceans. Global networking. Decisions made on one continent had direct consequences for others. New conflicts. The war indirectly led to the American Revolution, 1776, and the French Revolution, 1789. Man in war. In addition to the big politics, one must not forget the human dimension. Millions of people suffered from hunger, epidemics, and devastation. Prussia lost almost a third of its male population of military age. The civilian population in Saxony, Silesia, and Bohemia was particularly affected. In North America and India, indigenous peoples and local rulers were also involved in the war, mostly as losers. The 7 Years' War was not only a cabinet war of the rulers, but a catastrophe for entire societies. Lessons of war. The war revealed new realities. Finances are decisive. England was able to wage a long war through its economic power and loans. Naval power decides. The Royal Navy was the key to England's global victory. Coincidence and diplomacy. The miracle of the House of Brandenburg, Russia's change of course in 1762, shows how much political events could influence the course of the war. Discipline and tactics. Prussia's army became a role model in Europe. The legacy. The 7 Years' War was a foretaste of the world wars of the modern age. Global dimensions. Millions of people affected. Enormous economic burdens. Lasting changes in politics and society. For contemporaries, it was an unprecedented conflict. For historians, it is now considered the First World War in history. Result: the 7 Years' War was a key event of the 18th century. He brought Prussia onto the stage of world politics. It secured England's role as a world power. It weakened France and Spain in the long term. He initiated developments that led to the French Revolution, the American Revolution, and the rise of Europe in the 19th century. The war shows how closely politics, economics, diplomacy, and warfare were already intertwined in the 18th century, and that it was then that the world was truly united in a single, global conflict.